Greetings, Sonrise Church. We're here once again, ready to worship our God who is good all the time. I was just thinking over the past few weeks that we had it nice before when we could all come together and clap our hands and raise our hands and even hug each other if we wanted to. And now that we don't have that, I guess it's kind of sad that we didn't take advantage of that. However, we still have some freedom. Let's take advantage of that freedom that we have and worship our Lord. God bless you.
Jesus.
May I be like you.
Good morning, Sonrise family. I wanted to start things out with a prayer this morning, and then we will get into the Word. God, I thank you so much for another day that we can come and worship you and read about you and listen to the words of David and James and ponder on those lessons. And I just ask, Lord, that you'll help us to apply those words and those lessons to our hearts and our lives. Help us to live out a life that's focused on you so that we can glorify you, God, in all that we say and do. Help us to be mindful of the influences that are around us, and as well as how we influence others, God. You know, I pray. Amen. Well, I went to a private Christian college for my associates and my undergraduate degrees, and I went there to a Christian college, not necessarily knowing what I was walking into. And what I mean is, I quickly learned that just because it's a Christian college doesn't mean that you will automatically become a more spiritual person and not sin. I saw basically two camps in this college. I saw those that on the surface looked like they were sinless and holy and righteous. And on the other side, I saw people who pretty much wore their life on their sleeve. In other words, they were who they were, and they didn't hide anything. And yeah, they would sin, and they would fail, and they would fall, and they would pick themselves up again and continue on. Well, I didn't necessarily like one side or the other, but the longer I was there, I began to realize that the group of people that seemed to be righteous and perfect, actually, a lot of them had what's called the sin of partiality. And James chapter 2 talks about that, and if you want, you can research that and read about that a bit more. But basically, what I was witnessing was one group of people looking down and scoffing at the other group of people, because this group didn't look like or act like or think like this group of people. And you had to be, in order to be a good Christian, you had to look and think and act that way. So I was very frustrated, and I actually gravitated more towards this group because I felt like they were at least a more authentic group. Yeah, we sinned and we would fall flat on our face sometimes, but that's human nature, and that's reality. And I was really struggling with just having resentment and negative thoughts and actually scoffing, right, at those people that thought they were holier than I was. Well, as I grew up, I realized that this sin of partiality that this group was doing, thinking that they were better than other people, I was doing the exact same thing to them. I was looking down upon them for their actions and their thoughts and words in how they looked down upon this other group of people. So not to get too deep, but my sin of partiality was actually against their sin of partiality. I was looking down on them for looking down on other people. But I wasn't the only one. I am not the only one. We all have this inherent problem in our lives. All the time. If you look around the world, we see how politics separates people, right? it partitions people into separate camps. Long-standing race has done this, right? We have racial reconciliation still going on now in our country. We've got people of different ethnicities, cultures, backgrounds that are divided. One group looks down upon the other group. It even permeates into the local church. We have people in the church that have differing opinions on philosophy of ministry, on the color of the carpet, on how worship is to be done. And we divide ourselves up into these camps, and we tend to look down upon the other person. So it's very divisive, right? We live in a very divisive world. When I read David's psalm, the first psalm of his book, that was the first thing that I thought of was, man, this is a very divisive subject. The first psalm in the book of Psalms, David writes, "Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night." You see, at first appearance, I'm thinking, we have a group of people over here that are wicked and they're sinful and they're scoffers. And then over here we have people that are delighting in the law of the Lord, and they're reading their Bible and they're meditating on his word. And man, those are really great God, holy people. Man, over here there's the sinners and the scoffers and the evil people. But that was wrong. The more I looked into this, the more I realized David's not talking about separating. He's cautioning us to be mindful of the thoughts that are put in our minds. If we go to James, I'll explain this more. So in James chapter 1, verse 13 through 15, it says this: "Let no one say when he is tempted, 'I am being tempted by God.' For God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by his own lust. Then when lust has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and then sin is accomplished. When it is accomplished, it brings forth death." To summarize this, what James is talking about here is the process in which sin develops in our minds from a starting point of a thought, right? When we are tempted, we do not sin. Being tempted is simply the enticement of sin. But when we linger on that enticement, on that thought, and we begin to give it root, that thought becomes not just a fleeting thought, but now a permanent thought. And the longer that thought has in our mind, we act on that thought, either by thinking lustful thoughts or acting out in sinful ways of anger or resentment or ways of hatred, violence, all of the actions, right, that we typically do. And so when we act on those thoughts, that's when sin actually is birthed and sin becomes real. It's not the temptation that's wrong or that's evil. It's the sin that comes from the temptation when we have given in and have meditated on those thoughts of temptation. That's what gives birth to sin. So let's go back then. If we go back to David in Psalms chapter 1. Verse 1, again it reads, "Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of the sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scoffers." Blessed is the man who doesn't put himself in positions to be enticed and influenced by evil, by sinners, by scoffers. Because what happens when we put ourselves in situations where we are influenced by those things, then that influence is thoughts, is ideas, is philosophies, is wrong temptations that have a foot now in our mind. So he says, blessed is a man who doesn't put himself in those positions. But, in verse 2, his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. So instead of not doing this, we need to do this. So instead of putting ourselves in positions of negative influence, we need to be putting ourselves in positions of righteous influence, which is God's word, which is godly people speaking truth into your life, worshiping God, spending time in his word through meditation, right? Thinking on those things. That replaces those thoughts in our heads, in our minds. And instead of giving birth to sin, it gives birth to righteousness. Now our actions are being birthed out of holy, righteous, biblical passages, God's word. And those fruits, if you will, are producing holy actions. So as I read this, I realized, again, this is not about separating the good and the evil people. It's about recognizing when I give in to sin. And what is happening before I give in to sin can be stopped. During this time of transition, we have a transition in an election coming up, so there's politics. We have a transition in the pandemic as we're reopening the state. And we have a transition here at the church. It is crucial for us to keep our minds right, to keep us focused on God, focused on his words, so that we can give birth to righteous acts. As I said last week, we need to encourage one another to love and good works. It doesn't change. It's the same thing this week. We need to continue to encourage one another to love and good works. And we need to self-evaluate and make sure we are not promoting and influencing somebody else to sin. And we need to make sure we are influencing or being influenced by God through his word. That's how we proceed. That's how we progress. And that's how we move through these transitions in our lives. Whether you're on the right or left, whether you're for or against, whether you're here or not, we need to stay firm in his word so that we can stand firm within God and not sin, but instead encourage and influence others to be loving and holy. This is what we need to do going forward. I love you. I thank God for you. And I can't wait to gather with you again. Have a blessed week.